So how many of you are actually making games as services at the moment? Yeah, cool, cool. So maybe this will be a bit low level, high level, whatever. Feel free to push back if you disagree with any of this stuff. This is kind of like years of me running stuff and trying to communicate to people quite often who've never had to do it. So, given 20 minutes, hopefully we'll be running through this at quite a fast pace even. But again, please talk to me. I don't bite. I want to talk about live ops because I think in order to sort of really understand games as a service, you have to understand what things you're going to have to build. And quite often we're focused only on building the game. We're not thinking about the tools that we need in order to be sustainable post-release. And the old adage is 80% of the work starts after you launch. That's not an exaggeration in my experience, something I've had to deal with many a time. So what is live ops? It's juggling lots of different plates. I actually think it's probably easiest to think about as it's actually about managing the player life cycle. It's not just about your game, it's about understanding the journey of your player. And I think if you focus on that as a mindset, you'll find it's a lot easier to get your head around what live ops is about. I think events is one of the key factors of that. Events can be any number of shapes and forms, but essentially what I think it is predictable excitement. Something that I can actually do. How on earth do you make that happen? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that you need to think about what is appropriate for your game. I can't tell you what events will work for your game. Maybe you want to have May the 4th Star Wars Day for some reason. What would you do? Why would that be appropriate to you? Maybe it's a simple case of, I'm going to have a tournament every week that's going to last for 3 to 5 days, and at the end of that 3 to 5 days, there'll be something that happens that people get a prize for. I will always say, go look at Golf Clash as a way of looking at the way games work, because it's such a clever way of using tournament systems to create long-term engagement. But it was not just about the tournament. They'll have the prize fund for something crazy. That's the Maui Cup. Why the Maui Cup? Because it's cool. There's no real reason. It has to be. It could be timely. It could be a sponsored thing. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen. But the idea of tying in real world or in-game events that become meaningful and predictable for a player, predictability is key. So knowing that this thing is going to happen so I can look forward to it matters. In fact, one of the lessons I try and get people to understand that I learned back in the days of running an operator deck when I was, I get told off for saying this, when I was at 3, the mobile operator, we learned this thing where basically if we had a change of the deck every week, people came back every week. When we changed it so we updated the deck every day, guess how often people came back? Every day. When we changed it to every 4 hours, they came back every 4 hours. I know it sounds stupid, but that kind of predictability absolutely is key. And if you're not thinking about that and how you can make it the least work possible, so you don't have to have a person sitting there pressing a button every time you do an event, the better. Now, nothing wrong with having a person there too, but if you can avoid them having to be there, even better. Promotions. We want to sell things in our game. I know it's a dirty word for some people, but actually I'd like to make some money one day, maybe. And actually the lessons, again, remember we did free to play on PlayStation 3 in 2008, before you lot found out about free to play on mobile. So we were doing this stuff already. In fact, actually, I was doing the first ever mobile in-app purchase, we think, in 2003. I actually learned a huge amount from that because we had this method called, you had to rent a game for 50 pence and you got access to the game for 3 days. And when that expired, you, in the game, bought more, another 50p worth. And it was a complete failure. Except what we found out later on, when we rushed and panicked and got new buy games, we sold games at £5, or you could play the game for 50p for 3 days. A lot of games just had buy, some games had rent and buy. The games that had rent and buy had 3 times the sales. and most of it came from the buy, not the rent. But the fact of the rent made people more willing to pay. And that's just the start of the story. We released content, eventually the price changed to £6. I took 60% revenue share, by the way. I was evil. So I increased the price of games. I launched them at £6, and 6 weeks later, the 20 games I released each month were reduced to £3. And 6 weeks later, those games were reduced to £1. And 1 week later, those games were removed from the deck. And we told people this. And the revenue we got on the day of release, we got again on the day we made the price change to £3. And we got the same money again when we reduced it to £1. And we became so predictable that we had changes on every day of the week, which were representing a change of price or a change of game or a new game, and therefore we just ramped up the cash, which is why we earned 9 times the revenue of any other mobile operator at the time. Per user, by the way. Now, why am I going on about that? Because it's all about understanding what promotion is, and it's all about understanding how packaging and what you're doing in terms of making sure that the experience works, and how you can promote and you can communicate, how you can be predictable in the way you communicate, and understanding that your in-game experience is no different from me running an operator deck, because you're servicing an audience. And you need to be able to do that without having to have someone sit over a button every time they need to do it. So what are you doing to make that possible? Content. You're going to release new content over time. I hope so, otherwise your game is dead. The nice thing about content is I can release it by unlocking it. I mean, you've got to be careful, particularly on some of the rules of Apple and so on and so forth, exactly how you do this. But generally, you can release new content as a part of the online part of your experience, generally. And if you plan it, you can produce a whole bunch of content and over time release it on a regular basis. You can maybe produce, I don't know, work out how many levels you can make in a month, right? Let's say you make 30 levels in a month. You don't have to release 30 levels on the first of the month. You can release 1 level every day. But you don't release the 30 you did today, you do the 30 you did last month. And then 1 a day, because you've then got 30 a day, you're making another 30 every day, and therefore you've got this ongoing capacity to continually release on a regular basis, back to my every 4 hours topic. By the way, don't think we actually changed the deck every 4 hours. We just resorted it. That was it. There was no manual intervention at all. And we got the increased revenue as a result of it. So thinking about what you're building in order to make sure you can consistently release on an ongoing basis with the least possible effort means that you can be really scalable, and you can produce new assets, and you can streamline the asset production process. For example, if you can classify the kinds of assets your game needs into categories that you can build templates for, your economy of scale of building new content goes up, which means it's cheaper. Therefore, you get more profit. But none of that works unless it's desirable. Unless somebody is going to play more and pay more, even if that paying more is in the form of ads. So you have to think about what is the value of those assets. In fact, one of the biggest problems with content is people assume it's only about making more money. That's often wrong, particularly with levels and gameplay. If you're going to release content, like you're doing a narrative arc story thing, and you're going to release a new, subplot, do you think that it's better to make people pay for that subplot, or maybe it's better to make people, to give it to everybody, so they spend more money on health potions? I'd much rather people spend money on lots of health potions than a piece of content, because the likelihood is that if you see a piece of content, I can't guess the value of it, therefore I won't buy it, but if I do play it, I know the value of a health potion already. So many more people will spend money on assets that they understand than necessarily about content. But my point here is, How are you managing your pipeline? Are you even thinking about your content? Is a way of building a game that has an efficient distribution method, an efficient delivery method? Can you outsource it? There's lots of places where you can get much cheaper development of content assets than maybe you could afford in your local hometown. You know, there's lots of options here. And exactly the same thing applies to features, except it's a lot harder to upgrade your game without taking a long period of time to do that. You can't really update the game features every week because it's a bit complicated and messy, and you can always do damage to the audience if you happen to make a mistake. But if you don't ever update that game, people will assume it's dead. And people don't play dead games. If you're not investing in the game and seem to be investing in the game, it's over. But actually, this is my favorite thing about games as a service. Because as a designer, I never have to give up my favorite feature. Because when I don't prioritize a favorite feature because it doesn't fit yet, I can always make it part of a tentpole, a big, newsworthy item that I put in my later release. So I can actually keep a simple game when I first release and have these really interesting things that make gameplay richer and deeper and more exciting, assuming they're still valid, over time. That can then make it easy for me to talk about the new features that I've got in an exciting way that players care about. But you've got to think about what that means. You've got to have the processes in place to be able to release those things. You've got to understand what it means if you're going to take the current game, and upload it and change it and improve it. They have to be, sustainable. You've got to have a thorough process for testing it, so that you know that adding the new feature isn't going to break the game for everybody else. And you have to, identify, that those feature requirements do need to be communicated to the platform in quite a lot of cases, particularly Apple. So think about what that means in terms of your whole delivery process. Remember, we've talked about content releases, we've talked about events, and we've got to compartmentalize all of these pieces of work. And if you've got a small team, it's really hard to do. So that's why I talked about earlier, trying to make sure you don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to press the button every time you want an event, or press the button every time you want to do a promotion. Line it up, schedule things. The funniest thing is when some of the stuff we did, even in PlayStation Home, was a case of, we had a spreadsheet, which you had hosted on a server, and it had a time on it. And that event would take place when that timestamp was there. If that timestamp wasn't valid, the event didn't happen. And seriously, it's stupidly simple, provided it's secure. Problem management. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with people and they've not thought about this. Who is going to deal when someone finds a bug, finds a problem, or worst case, finds somebody blocking somebody, the kind of offensive behavior that can happen, particularly in social games. We had to, the most difficult one of these, I first encountered when I was working at British Telecom with a system called Wireplay, which is an online gaming service, and we had to have a single point of contact with the Metropolitan Police Authority in London. Why? Because people could share video and images. So if somebody were to share illegal material, for example, child pornography, it would be illegal for our community managers to hold that information. It's actually illegal. They would be responsible for that if they did something with that asset, that file. So we had to have processes in place that were cleared by the police authority so that we could help them gather evidence against people who were acting inappropriately. Fortunately, it never happened. But we had to be prepared for that in case it did. How many people are thinking about what happens if somebody posts something completely offensive and inappropriate? And how you deal with that legally without actually putting your staff at risk? That's a really fundamental question. So thinking about those kind of things, problem management, how you gather information through community management, how you gather it through game data, user reports. You have a responsibility for your community, even if you don't realize it. Even if you're using external tools, you can't necessarily use that as a defense. You have to make sure you think about this, how you deal with those problems as they occur, and you process it. And there's amazing things out there already. You can use Zendesk to do this kind of stuff, to get automated, processes. But you don't want the guy who's going to do the coding answering every one of those problems if it's a technical problem, because you basically stop functioning. Seriously, and a number of people, I cannot tell you how many times some of our senior coders at Sony got called out for something which turned out to be trivial until we worked out how to fix it. It sounds so obvious in hindsight, but there's a reason why a lot of these big companies have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 support. It's not because they want to formalize things and make things scary. It's because tier 1 deal with people. They don't have to answer the question. They just have to know it's a question that's worth answering. Tier 2 decide who's going to answer it. Tier 3 fix it. That's it. It's not complicated. But if you don't think about it, if you don't build it into your plans, into your processes, you're kind of screwed. This is kind of my attempt at a joke. I'm not really sure it's a good one, but you'd have to know the TV show to get it. Awesome TV show, by the way. Even if Chevy Chase was a little dubious in the later series. But the point about community, your community management is not separate from your game. Or I would argue it shouldn't be. And, I don't cover UA in this talk, by the way. User acquisition I don't cover in the live ops part. There is an argument that it should be, but I think it's a different function. But I think community management is part of this process, because it's actually how you deal with a lot of the issues and problem management as it occurs. It's a lot of how it's key and pivotal to how you make sure that the events and the promotions and all the content releases and all the feature releases are effectively communicated to the audience, and importantly, how we get feedback to make sure we do the right content, feature, events, promotions that matter to that audience. So understanding how you integrate your community tools in with your problem management, in with your events, in with your feature releases, your content releases is, I think, critically important. But it doesn't have to be complicated. You have to sit down and think of what can I do given the resource and the team and the skills that we've got in-house. Do we have to do this all ourselves? Do we have to build it? Or can we use something, a Chili Connect or I've got all the name of the different makes now. There's so many different, like GameSparks, for example, out there that we could use. Could we use those? Could they help solve our problem? Could we apply the way that we use them to make that process a lot simpler? And I haven't even got into analytics, because I see Andrew sitting there and looking at me, because I'm helping working with them on Fathom and the analytics, distributed analytics tools that these guys are doing. And again, that should definitely be integrating what you do, but what I'm trying to get across here is that if you don't think about these things before you finish building your game, it's too late. The real value, I think, at the moment is understanding that we can use service delivery to be able to make sure that whatever game we release, we can improve and we can maximize the returns on. That doesn't happen if you don't think about the operational side. And it's a virtuous circle. Live ops is about managing constant change. And by putting your thought into the structure of how you bring this together, you can save a lot of pain and actually deliver a huge amount of value. These are the things to think about. Who is the live ops team? What is their objective in each of these parts? How are they going to deal with these things? Think about that. There are motives and opportunities in building these tools, either directly yourself or by applying tools which are available off the shelf right now. So that's it. And obviously, happy to take any questions. There's a question back. I'm gonna be my own microphone boy. So because hey, look, what's the fun if I don't get to talk to everybody?
So what are your thoughts on customer support as opposed to community? Right now, I do both mobile and console games, but on the mobile game, I work on the publishing side, and there's been kind of a push and pull of whether or not to have that with the live ops team, to outsource. I'm of the mindset that having them with the live ops team is better.
Yeah, it's difficult because I was trying to make this generic. I didn't want to go, no, it's the right question to ask. It kind of saves me in some ways because otherwise I'd skip it. You're absolutely right. There is a difference between customer relationship management and community. Because essentially, arguably, customer CRM is basically damage limitation to a certain extent, but it's also about kind of supporting that purchase process, but also the more kind of commercial aspect of the experience with the player. But that's where I include that in problem management in general. So when I'm talking about problem management, I'm often talking about dealing with those kind of issues. It's more complicated when you're talking about physical goods that are also made available, because then you're in a whole different, like, returns and all this other stuff, which is way messier. And especially if you've done Kickstarter. We are still getting people who are saying, oh, I didn't get my T-shirt. But you never filled the form in. It was 2 years ago. How can we get you a T-shirt if you didn't fill in your form 2 years ago when we asked you? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but obviously we have to find a way to get them their T-shirt, and we want to because we want them to get their goods. But we look like we're the bad guys because we didn't get them filling in the form at the time we asked them. Anyway, but that's why I think it's really difficult to get that right balance. Any last questions before I move on? And on that note, I am going to thank you very much for me. It's weird hosting myself.